It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker and a member of the Library Committee, Anthony Bellov, a native of Brooklyn, a long-time Upper West Sider with a Bachelor in Architecture from Pratt Institute. He's pretty smart. And a Master in Museum Leadership from Bank Street College. A singer, pianist, and a voice teacher, award-winning videographer, avid preservationist, can't even read, New York history buff, and most importantly, a proud artist member of the Salmagundi Club. Put them all together and you get Anthony Bellov.
I love it, the chair of the library committee, but he can't read. Okay, he has glasses on, so that's okay. Good evening, everybody, and I'm so pleased to see you all here. We are going to have some fun tonight, so hunker down and get ready for it. Before I begin the actual program, a couple of thank yous I need to do, and I need to introduce you all to a very distinguished, you're all distinguished guests, but somebody I want to point out to you all is Richard Moses, sitting right there near the back. Richard is the head of LESPI, the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, and for his doctorate or master's? Master's. For his master's degree, he wrote the definitive history and analysis of the building you're sitting in right now. The last three talks I gave in the before Salmagundi series were specifically about this building, and there is no way I could have given those presentations without Richard. So, hearts to you, Richard. Thank you so much for that work of love, which is so important.
You added a lot of important information, so thank you.
Okay, you'll get your money afterwards. So, now, why are we having this talk tonight about Fifth Avenue? In the past, I've spoken about the clubhouse itself, which was formerly the Holly and then the Park Mansion. But you may or may not know, we are celebrating a year-long celebration of the 200th anniversary of the opening of Fifth Avenue. In 1824, Fifth goes back 200 years this year. So there'll be a lot of programs in the course of the year about Fifth Avenue. Again, I would like to thank my co-sponsors who have been thanked already, the Salmagundi Library, Village Preservation, Coffee House Club, Merchants House Museum, and the Victorian Society. They've all been great supporters, not only of the work I do, but of the work that we do here at Salmagundi, and I thank them all. Copious thanks. I need to thank Tom Miller, the author of the blog post, Daytonian in Manhattan. How many of you here read Daytonian in Manhattan? Okay, that's pretty good. Should be more hands. Every day, 6 days a week, Tom posts a single building somewhere in Manhattan, and he analyzes the building, talks about its funky history and all the things that happen to it. It's a wonderful post. I check it every morning because I'm a dream, because I like to wake up to something like that. And I could not be giving this talk tonight without all the work that Tom has done in advance to present information to me. He would be here tonight, but he's giving a talk elsewhere in the city. So, Daytonian in Manhattan, it's worth it. It's worth it. When you remember it, check it out. Okay, now, moving right into the program itself. I want to stress before we begin that this is not a comprehensive history of Lower Fifth Avenue. That would take 5 or 6 minutes longer than I'm going to speak tonight. But what this will be is kind of a walking tour up Fifth Avenue from Washington Square to 14th Street, the confines of the village, and I have picked buildings that I personally find interesting, either architecturally or historically, or for some of the juicy stories that have been produced in them over the years. So I'm going to be very selective in what we talk about tonight. So apologies if your favorite vanished mansion is not mentioned in our talk, but I'm guessing it will be. And right at the start, it's important that you all grasp immediately. Fifth Avenue was not laid out as New York's primary sine qua non address. It happened over the course of time. It happened in a sort of a random development. So what you're looking at here is the Ratzer map. This is a very famous map that historians and I allude to frequently in our talks. And this is a representation of Lower Manhattan and the Upper Harbor in 1767, 1768. The British commissioned this map from Bernard Ratzer because they basically wanted to have an idea of what they owned. And New York, even when it was very underdeveloped, as opposed to overdeveloped, but I didn't say that, had an extremely important harbor. The best harbor in North America, one of the best harbors in the world. And so they knew that this city was going to be significant. Now mind you, this map dates to about 100 years after the British basically seized New Amsterdam from the Dutch. So we're looking at a city that's already almost 150 years old at this point. But you can see it's largely farmland. So here's a close-up of the area, as best as I could surmise, is where our Fifth Avenue, the Fifth Avenue we'll be talking about tonight, exists. It's a little hard to tell because there's absolutely nothing there. All we see are the two post roads and the old Bloomingdale Road, which some of you may know is kind of, sort of Broadway, but not really. And so really, the area that we're talking about 50 years before Fifth Avenue was christened, just simply did not exist. In 1785, the city of New York hired Casimir Gerg to survey what they called the common lands. This was an area of Manhattan Island that was owned by the city, starting at about 23rd Street today and going up as far as Harlem Village. The city was broke. You probably know, after the Revolutionary War, the city was in ruins. There had been two serious fires during the Revolution. It had been occupied by British troops for the entire duration of the war. And the city was literally in ruins and broke. And they needed to do something to forestall, not foreclosure, but bankruptcy. So they said, we have to sell the common lands. So they engaged Gork to survey the lands and divide them more or less into 5-acre plots, which they then put up for sale. But what's significant about this map is he chose to run a road called the Middle Road, right up the middle of the lands. So it was a very convenient name. That spine becomes very significant when the commissioner's map occurs. And here you probably recognize this, the Commissioner's Map of 1811. This is the famous commission that divided Manhattan Island up to 155th Street into the gridiron street system it currently still largely displays. Why did they stop at 155th? Because they just could not imagine the city going any further past that for hundreds of years while they were wrong. And there is the Middle Road, which in 1811 was christened Fifth Avenue. So, as I said before, why Fifth Avenue? Why not somewhere else? And in fact, before Fifth Avenue even existed on paper, there was somewhere else. Actually, several elses. But before we talk about the elses, I want to talk just for a moment about the map you're looking at right now. I have used this map many times in my talks. And I've always noted it as the Drips map of 1852. What an awful name for a map. And then this time around, when I was putting this talk together, I said, why do they call it the Drips map? And Anthony was named after the man who made it. Matthew Drips, who was born in Ireland in 1812, fled the famine in 1849, landed in Philadelphia, and then relocated to Brooklyn in 1850, where he set himself up as a map publisher. And soon became famous for these enormous, highly detailed maps of the city of New York, aka Manhattan. Remember, the city of New York and Manhattan were one and the same in those days. All little black spots on this map represents the footprint of a building. So he was probably more than just a little obsessive. But nowadays it's wonderful to have this map because it tells us so much about New York in the mid-century. And here's a close-up of that map. And this represents the first of the really great, exclusive, wealthy neighborhoods in the city. And this really dates back to prior to the Civil Yes, it does. To the Revolutionary War, the Bowling Green and State Street area. You can see there it is right down there at the foot of the island. And let's zoom in a little bit closer. So what you see here is the remnants of that neighborhood. Remember, by 1852, New York had moved uptown. But here is State Street, curving around here. This open area is the Battery, as they call it, now Battery Park. What we know of as Castle Clinton was called Castle Garden in those days, and it was out in the middle of the water. All of this is landfill now. And then here is Bowling Green, right here. This is the oldest park in New York City. It was originally cattle, pasture land during Dutch times, and it became a park officially in 1753. And if you look around, even in 1852 when this map was drawn, you can still see individual buildings all along this side, the west side of Broadway. Although on the east side, a lot of the lots have filled in and become warehouses and such by now. But this gives you an idea of what was so special about that combined neighborhood. Here in the lower right-hand corner is a drawing of Bowling Green itself in 1831. Bowling Green still very much looks like that. The fence dates back to the 18th century, and it's still there. And I talk about that in another video. But here, even in 1831, you can still see around the sides all of these palatial homes, which by 1831 had largely been converted to hotels and boarding houses. But it just shows you how beautiful the Bowling Green area was after the Revolution and into the 1820s. Here's a photo of Bowling Green and the southern end of it in 1869, and even that late, these wonderful palatial row houses are still all facing Bowling Green. By the way, that was called Steamship Row, because it was, by this point, all the offices of the various steamships, before the Cunard Building, White Star, and all that. But if you look past, and these houses remain standing into the very early 20th century, when they were replaced by the big customs house that's there now, and now is the Museum of the Native American Indian. Here in the distance, the harbor, and here right along the edge, Battery, which is right here. This is an engraving of State Street in 1852. And it shows you, even that late, even though these houses were no longer private residences, you get why this was such a popular, such an exclusive neighborhood. Those breezes, on a hot summer's day, if you go down to Battery Park, it's really delicious. So, but the little arrow indicates the one building here that is still standing. Yeah, slight change of scale here. This is the James P. Watson House, 7 State Street. Why is it still standing? It's owned by the Catholic Church. And it became part of a mission in the later 19th century to aid immigrant Irish girls just as they would step off the boat, because people had been waiting to get them into their nefarious clutches. And the church and the mission were there to steer them along the path of good and righteousness and get them jobs in good houses where they could be servants and establish their footing in the new world. What's really significant about this house, first of all, architecturally, it is truly unique. It's a splendid example of pure federal architecture, and built in 1793. It's largely intact. And I'm so sorry that it is never open to the public, because it really should be. Historically, it's extremely important. But a little while later, fashion in the form of commerce, because commerce done her wrong, guys, pushed the wealthy and the residents right up off the tip of the island. And all those beautiful houses became warehouses and office buildings, and you know what it looks like now. So a lot of the wealthy moved up to the first area in the city that was really designed with the intention of the wealthy. And if you look at good old Mr. Drips's map, down here is the triangle of City Hall Park. Way up here is Washington Square. Here is Canal Street. And here was Hudson Square, St. John's Park. This is a close-up of it, and this is significant because we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Because if you look around here, you'll see that surrounding the park, the footprint of really substantial houses. But if you look over towards the river, it's warehouses. If you look a little bit east, it's all just simple, basic row houses, nothing grand about them. And then Canal Street is lined with shops, even as early as the 1820s. So this was an enclave, surrounded by a very different city. This is what it looked like. This is a print of St. John's Park in 1826, a magnificent Georgian church. Surrounding of the park were beautiful townhouses, very much along the lines of what you saw down on Steamship Row. The park was private, like Gramercy Park. You needed a key to get inside. It was landscaped, and it was open only to the shareholders of the park, who were the people who lived around it. But commerce stepped in. Commerce in the way of Commodore Vanderbilt. In the 1850s, Vanderbilt ran a rail line up the western side of the park, and he built a huge rail terminus here with warehouses upstairs. And by this point, the wealthy were already leaving because the park had become dangerous. The neighborhood around it was filled with rough sailors and hooligans and working class people, and the residents of St. John's Park were actually being mugged. So it was no longer a good time. Plus, the city was moving north. It was just a matter of time before St. John's went the way of Bowling Green and State Street. By the way, this is St. John's Park today. It is the exit ramps to the Holland Tunnel. So it was a very convenient place to put them. And, all right, yes, that's horrible. But St. John's Park was lost to us long before the invention of automobiles. And the fact that it's still an open space, and actually, those of you who know it today, there's still a whole lot of cars going around it, but there's some greenery there too. So in a way, I'm glad it's still there. But there was another area, almost contemporary with St. John's Park, maybe just a little later, and this was the Bond Street, Lafayette Place area that was being developed exclusively for the wealthy. The wealthy were wanting more and more their own, seclusive area, someplace where they could just be by themselves and not have to deal with the riffraff. Excuse me. So this is Lafayette Place. At the time, it was only about 3 blocks long. Bond Street down here was arguably the best address in the city. And if you look up here in Washington Place, one of the access points to Washington Square, which is right here. Remember, this map is 1852. One of these houses right here, the big double wides, on this side of the block was the first mansion of Commodore Vanderbilt, the man who ruined St. John's Park. So, ironically, there he is living there. But we're talking the wealthiest of the wealthy. Let me show you a photo of it. This is in 1866. So, by this point, the neighborhood was already on the skids. I have sort of this gauge in my mind. Every 20 or 25 years, neighborhoods in New York, particularly at that time, seemed to change. Because the city was moving upwards, so you could always keep up with changes in developments and the styles of architecture. So, generally speaking, every 20 or 25 years, you'll see a whole changeover in what's going on in any particular neighborhood. Not so much now, because now nobody can afford any neighborhood. But this is 1866, really about 15 years after this area ceased being the best address in New York. But it was still a good address. Yeah. This is what happened 20 years later. Suddenly, there's huge asteroid came crashing down and killing all the dinosaurs. Oh, no, that's it. Sorry. This is a Devin Press building, dropped on the corner of East 4th Street and Lafayette Place. It's kind of horrifying to us today, although it's one of the nicest buildings in the neighborhood now. It's really a superb building. But I especially love this photograph because in it you can see the surviving patrician homes. Here on Lafayette Place, here on East 4th Street, and even though they're all row houses, so there were some freestanding mansions on Lafayette Place, but mostly row houses. These are the best of the best, at least as good as anything as you will find standing today anywhere in Manhattan. And this area, luckily, has some survivors. The last two neighborhoods, all that's left standing of them is the Watson House. St. John's Park, there's not a brick left. But here in the Bond Street, Lafayette Place area, we have some survivors. Here in the upper left-hand corner is what remains. These are the ruins of Colonnade Row, Grange Terrace. There was originally 9 row houses. Now we're down to 4, and they're crumbling before our eyes. Down at the bottom, of course, is the Public Theater, which began life as the Astor Library. It was developed in 3 pieces over the course of 20 years, from 1849 to 1869. It's a beautiful building today, and it gives you a little bit of a clue of how nice it was there at one time. But the star of the show, certainly in my mind, is the Merchant's House Museum. And if you have not been to the Merchant's House Museum yet, why not? It is so important, it is so wonderful, an intact 1832 row house with the furniture the family used still in it. It's like a little bubble landed over this building when the neighborhood was falling apart, and it's still there to this day. But anyway, this is basically all that's left of the Bond Street, Lafayette Place neighborhood. But contemporaneously with it, there was another neighborhood, 2nd Avenue. I was like, what? Second Avenue. 2nd Avenue was a good neighborhood? 2nd Avenue was where all the millionaires were moving, and for a short time in the late first half of the 19th century, it gave 5th Avenue quite a run for its money. Here is 2nd Avenue right here. Just to give you a point of reference, here's St. Mark's in the Bowery. Up here is Stuyvesant Square. And this was the magnet that drew people to 2nd Avenue. This is what 2nd Avenue looked like back in the day, as late as 1865. Stuyvesant Square, important, you're noticing a trend here. There was Battery Park and Bowling Green. There was St. John's Square. Here's Stuyvesant Square. We also will be dealing with Gramercy Park, with Union Square. These squares tended to be magnets that drove expensive properties to them. But what went wrong here is that the Stuyvesants, who were developing 2nd Avenue, delivered Stuyvesant Square as promised in 1836, but the city fell back on their own development, and they didn't wind up opening Stuyvesant Square fully developed, fully landscaped, until 1850. Then just north of St. Mark's in the Bowery, they ain't nothing, folks. You see these empty blocks? This is 1852. By this point, Lower 5th Avenue was almost completely developed. So, what done 2nd Avenue in? Basically commerce, procrastination, and of course we all know the immigration that was going on in the city at that time. The Lower East Side was filling with immigrants, and already tenement buildings were being constructed. 2nd Avenue was just too uncomfortably close. And then the more affluent Germans moved into 2nd Avenue, made it Kleine Deutschland, which was apparently a wonderful place to live for a long time, but not if you were a millionaire. And the winner, as we all know now. Now, these arrows here indicate 2nd Avenue and Lafayette Place. So look how close Washington Square is. And here's 5th Avenue launching northwards from there. But when these two areas and St. John's Park were already developed and very affluent places to live, this is what Washington Square looked like. Thank you. This is 5th Avenue in the 1820s, just leaving Washington Square. It was still basically the middle road. But this was not going to last for very long, because in 1824, the year 5th Avenue was opened, it was opened because this happened. This is Washington Square, a marvelous painting of it in 1851. You probably all know that it was originally a cemetery and a potter's field, and the estimates are between 10 and 20,000 graves are still right underneath the pavement. When they do development in Washington Square, they hit bones, and they're not doggy bones. But Washington Square was a breath of green air in a sea of brick. Vanderbilt's house was right over here, right down the street, and this is the original NYU building here. So you had Washington Square, a square like in the other places, and within a few years of its opening in 1824, houses, patrician houses, circled the square, logically speaking, but then there was this sort of safety valve, the street moving northwards from Washington Square, which none of the other squares had. This is a drawing of Washington Square in 1871, and we'll talk about this drawing in a few minutes. But that arrow indicates the start of Fifth Avenue. So again, remember, when those other neighborhoods were in their glory, Fifth Avenue appeared only on paper. It was basically an embryo at that point. But when Second Avenue dropped the ball, they moved over. One of the important things, thank you Rosette Broderick for this terminology, was that Fifth Avenue was bounded by what she calls anchor houses. On the east side of Fifth Avenue is the famous Row. And there's a photo of it to the left, dating back about 100 years, and here it is today. And you can see it's still very much the same. And on the west side of Fifth Avenue, we have another anchor house, the old Rhinelander Mansion, which was built about 6 years later and designed by Richard Upjohn. His name is going to figure prominently in today's talk. The Rhinelander Mansion was one of the grandest houses of New York at that time. This is Washington Square North. It's not there anymore, I'm sorry to report to you. But with the row of Grecian houses on one side and the Grecian houses on the other side, specifically the Rhinelander Mansion, it became a siphon, sort of pulling people up Fifth Avenue. And more significant than either of those was the Brevoort Mansion on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 9th Street. It was built in 1834 on Brevoort property, smart boy, and it was the very first house built on Fifth Avenue. And in this slide, I tried to take all the other houses away. So you get an idea of what Henry Brevoort was complaining about in 1834 when he said he felt like he was in a house in the middle of the woods. Because there was simply no one else there at that time. But the cherry on the top, what really defined the square and Fifth Avenue, came much later. This is a photo of the original Washington Arch in 1889. It was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary. It's hard to believe it was only 100 years before that George Washington became the first president of the United States. It was built of wood and plaster, intended to be temporary. And if you look at this image, here on the left is the Rhinelander Mansion. Here on the right is one of the Grecian houses of the row. And down here, if you look down here, you can see there are reviewing boxes. There's stands here. So this engraving was done just at the time when the parade happened. But people liked the arch so much that they said, let's build a permanent one. And so they had a subscription, they raised oodles of money, and they got Stanford White to design a stone Washington Arch, which was built in 1892 and set in the park itself, as this was a better place to put it than straddling a sidewalk. So we're right at the foot of Fifth Avenue now, but here are the anchor houses that I was telling you about. Here's the row, the original 1832, 1833 row, and here is the Rhinelander, where was the Rhinelander Mansion of 1840. What happened to that mansion? It lasted into the 20th century and was converted into apartments. And although there was a lot of protest in 1950, it was demolished. It really didn't look like itself anymore. But it was demolished, but the developers put up a modern apartment building that was very respectful, as you can see, of the scale and the style of Washington Square North. Very unusual for 1950, so my hat's off to the designers. But before we start moving up Fifth Avenue, let me point out one thing to you. The eagle above the keystone in the arch, and there's another one on the north side of the arch as well, sculpted by Philippe Martini. Big deal. Well, yes, Philippe Martini was a Salmagundian. And if you go downstairs, those of you who have dinner or having dinner afterwards, make a point of walking through the bar for a moment. Those of you who aren't having dinner, head for the bar. But you will see on each side of the staircase going down to the pool room downstairs, these two wonderful grotesque figures on each side in neat angles opening down into the bar. And those were sculpted by Philippe Martini in 1917 when Salmagundi bought this building and converted it into a clubhouse. He was an extremely highly regarded architectural sculptor. His work, there's a lot of his work in New York City. A lot of his work is no longer present because he worked mostly in a substance called staff, which is a cementitious plaster, and so it would last for a while, but it was not meant to last permanently. You think of the famous White City, the St. Louis Exposition, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He was responsible for the lion's share of all the sculpture on those buildings. So, hooray for Salmagundian. Yes, thank you. And here we go. Here's our walking tour. This is an early photo of the arch with the Rhinelander and the Rome, the mansions intact on each side. So we're going to walk right underneath that building, and we're going to begin our walking tour now. And the first building we see, salud! The first building we see is number 1 Fifth Avenue. What a classy address, huh? Except when it went up in 1835, it was the second building built on Fifth Avenue, and James Borman had no idea what was going to happen to the avenue. So what Borman decided to do, unlike Brevoort, was to build a house which he intended to be a schoolhouse for the affluent girls of the neighborhood, of girls' school. And if you look at the building, it's really nothing to write home about. It's basically a brick wall with a lot of windows punched into it, very simple details. It's kind of Grecian because that's the era we were talking about. But he did not go for any bells and whistles because who knew what was going to happen on Fifth Avenue? So he designed this exclusive school with the intention of attracting neighborhood girls, Washington Square people, people around Bond Street, around Lafayette Place. And shortly thereafter, the Mrs. Greens, who were two sisters from New Hampshire, purchased the building and opened their school here, and it was extremely successful. And just a short while later, their brother, Andrew Haswell Green, moved in to live with them. I heard ooze. Okay, those of you who really know about New York history know how important this person is. We're not going to talk at this detail with every building, but he really deserves being singled out because he's a tremendously important influence in New York. You see right here, right up here, that he's called the father of Greater New York. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it depends which borough you were born in. And we'll talk about that too. But he came and lived with his sisters. When they moved out and moved their school elsewhere, he stayed put and became his mansion. In 1845, when he was starting out, he was a lawyer in the office of future U.S. presidential candidate Samuel J. Tilden. 10 years later, he became New York City School Board president. He became one of the commissioners of the Central Park Commission. And he was the man expressly responsible for persuading the commission to accept the Olmsted and Vaux Greensboro plan. He became a nemesis to your friend and mine, Boss 3. Other projects that he oversaw during the commission was Riverside, Morningside, Philip Washington Parks. He refined the street plan above 155th Street. He widened and straightened Broadway, and he created Columbus Circle, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1870, he became New York City Comptroller, and he was brought in specifically to address the shambles the city finances were in after Boss Tweed and his cronies had plundered the treasury repeatedly. And there's an interesting story about that too. He was framed during his time as comptroller. Right here in front of this door, so it's the door to this building, on July 2nd of 1873, he was walking to his house with his pal and lawyer, James C. Carter, when he was stopped by the clerk of arrests of the city, who attempted to throw him in the hoosegow because he claimed that Green had made $500 of city money vanish. Now, $500 was a lot more money back then than it is today. The whole plan was to besmirch his name because this was right during the Tweed trials. And if he could compromise Green's reputation, maybe Tweed stood a better chance of being acquitted of some of the crimes he was accused of. I mean, they were a little put off by this whole thing, but he reaches into his vest pocket, pulls out the cash that he had, which was $350, which was more than $6,500 in today's money. So it's like, who walks around with $6,000 in their vest, or who even wears a vest anymore? He was able to get the other $150 out of the house, and he said, "Here, take it." And so the whole frame-up was completely thwarted by the fact that he walked around with thousands of dollars in his pocket. Don't move. A little bit more on Green before we move on, because this man was incredible. He established the Niagara Parks Commission, which was New York's first state park. And what word should come after Niagara? Falls. Exactly. The falls are there today because of this man. He was also the executor of Tilden's Trust, and he combined it with the Astor and Lenox libraries, leading to the creation of the New York Public Library. In the 1890s, he proposed a plan for the city of Greater New York, the consolidation of the 5 boroughs that we know today. That's why he's called the father of Greater New York. He rallied New Yorkers in 1894 to save the 1812 City Hall from demolition. It's still standing today because of him. This man is just unbelievable. He was also president of the New York Zoological Society, which is located where? The Bronx, right, from 1895 to 1897. What happened to this miracle worker? On November 13th, 1903, he was walking up to his home. He had bad luck with doors, apparently. He was living at Park Avenue and 40th Street at that time, so he flew the coop. But he was shot 5 times outside his door by Cornelius Williams, who mistook him for businessman John R. Platt, who was the lover of Hannah Elias, a lady of the evening. So the moral of the story, Green should have stayed on Fifth Avenue, and if he had done that, he'd still be alive today. So moving right along. In 1877, William Butler Duncan and his family bought the house and made it their mansion for a substantial length of time, about a half a century. I'm not going to do this with all the houses, but this house, excuse me, has such an amazing history that I just could not leave this stuff alone. So what was so great about him? If you read diaries and books of the era, if you're an expert or a groupie of the late 19th century, you know this man, you know this name. He was a partner in the New York branch of the London bank firm of Duncan and Sherman. He was one of the 25 subscribing members to the iconic Patriarch's Ball. And I should hear, ooh, thank you. If you don't know what the Patriarch's Ball is, another Salmagundian member, Carl Raymond, has a wonderful podcast called The Gilded Gentleman, and he talks about the Patriarch's Ball in one of those podcasts. It couldn't be any more exclusive. Only 25 families were members of the Patriarchs. And they included his pals, the Kennedys, the Carnegies, the Rhinelanders, the Astors, the Van Rensselaers, the Livingstons, and the Schermerhorns. So these were the people that he sipped tea with. For a while, until his death in 1912, he was considered officially New York's premier citizen. So that's all. Then all this going on in this little simple, nondescript house. His son, daughter, and grandchildren remained in the house until 1923, when it was leased for 3 years. They all skedaddled uptown. They couldn't stay downtown anymore. And then, of course, the inevitable happened. Yeah. In 1926, the entire block was razed. The house we're talking about, plus the 3 adjoining houses. Now, I mean, I have to admit, 1 Fifth Avenue today is a mighty good-looking building. It's a beautiful Art Deco tower. But that's what happened. And that's what's going to happen to pretty much every other building we visit now on this tour. Of all the buildings we're going to talk about, only 3 of them are still standing. The John Taylor Johnston House, 1856. And you'll see on the map it's blank, because this map dates to 1852. So this house was built 4 years later. So there he is, John Taylor Johnston, son of a Scots-born shipping baron and banker. He was wealthy and sophisticated. And one of the things he did that was particularly noteworthy is that when everybody else, I love that sound, when everybody else was building brownstone, Fifth Avenue was almost exclusively brownstone down here because that was the stone of choice in the 1840s and 1850s. He decided to advertise his wealth by building his lavish mansion, as I said, out of white Vermont marble. In case you don't realize, marble from Vermont is way more expensive than brownstone from New Jersey. So he was really advertising something. And he also appreciated that an Italianate house should be white, not brown. And this could be a palazzo somewhere in Italy, dating back to anywhere after the late Renaissance. Italianate. Italianate looks like Italian houses, so it was a very creative name to him. He was a passionate art collector, and his huge house rapidly became too small to accommodate his art collection. So he expanded into his stables, which were right behind the house. They were on 8th Street. He created an extremely important art collection, which he opened to the public once a year. Now, you need to understand that all of these mansions were full of costly art, full of sculptures and all sorts of objets, but it doesn't mean they were all good or that they were all authentic. His stuff was. He knew what he was doing. His collection included works by such masters as Daubigny, Breton, Corot, Thomas Cole, Gilbert Stuart, Frederick Church, and Turner. On December 19th of 1870, he gathered together a bunch of millionaires with the idea of dazzling them with his art collection. So he invited the likes of James Beekman, J.P. Morgan, Rutherford Stuyvesant, Alexander Van Rensselaer, and artists including Salman Gundy's own John Lafarge, Albert Bierstadt, Frederick Church, and architects like James Renwick, Calvert Vaux, and Richard Morris Hunt. And he showed off his art because he wanted to raise the initial monies for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that night they raised $45,000 of the needed $250,000 to create the museum, which was initially housed in the former Dogworth Mansion at 618 Fifth Avenue at 53rd Street. And that is the first home of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you can see just by looking at it, 4 windows wide. It's a mansion, folks. Bay window. Entrance to the side. This is very similar to the house you walked into tonight. He passed in 1893, leaving sizable fortunes to his 4 children and big bequests to the Metropolitan and the City University of New York. In 1898, his son-in-law, Malik, became the Consul General to France. So you can imagine there were some pretty nice parties in this building. And the house began to get be christened Marble House. The Rhinelanders still owned the entire block, however. These houses were on leased land. And in 1928, they decided it was time to sell their property. So all these people were going to have to give up their estates, which was not really a problem because by this point, most of these houses were boarding houses anyway, and the families had long ago skedaddled up to the East 60s and the East 70s. But the Great Crash, the Depression, held up the development. The house became apartments. In the 1950s, the stables behind it were home to the Clay Club, which provided studio space for artists. But as is inevitable, especially in this talk, in 1950, the money was assembled, the properties were all assembled, and it was announced that the whole block was coming down for a modern development. There was a lot of protesting when Marble House was going to be torn down, which is interesting because in 1950, the idea of demonstrations to preserve a historic building just did not exist in this country. So very, very early manifestation. And here's a marvelous photo. This is the building we were just talking about. We're going to move on to this building, which many of you would recognize if you know Fifth Avenue at all. This photo is from Fifth Avenue, New York, from start to finish, by photographer Burton Wells, who in 1911 brought his camera with a very expensive wide-angle panoramic lens and photographed Fifth Avenue all the way from the start. This is the first building, and if you look, the first photo, and if you look here, there's the arch, and there's the Rhinelander Mansion. And he walked all the way to 93rd Street, where Fifth Avenue stopped in those days, and he documented the whole street. The middle of the avenue was already lost. It was all commercial buildings by this point. But Lower Fifth Avenue still looked very much in 1911 the way it did 50 years prior. So we're very lucky to have these photos. And now we're going to talk about 10th Fifth Avenue. I'm sure many of you recognize this building. It's still standing there today, although we all know it's in perilous condition right now. Here is where it's situated, right here on the corner of 8th Street and Fifth Avenue. And it was developed by Henry Bradford. He built 4 row houses on that side of the street because he was bringing people to Fifth Avenue to increase the value of Fifth Avenue and make sure it remained patrician. So there were 4 houses originally. This marvelous photo shows you the 2 houses furthest north in the row. And so you can see what this house looked like when it had a stoop and front door here. So you get a note storefronts on the ground floor. The house was bought by iron merchant Thomas Eggleston, and he lived there very happily for about 30 years. His son, Thomas Eggleston Jr., was also involved in the iron business, in the mine business, and he persuaded Columbia College in 1864 to open the first school of mining in North America. So that done, he felt that he had served mankind, and so he pretty much sat back and started buying fancy things and going on long trips. But he did do something else that was very significant. He organized a group of local homeowners to defy Boss Tweed's attempts to destroy Washington Square. Yes, I was dumbfounded when I discovered this because I had no idea that Washington Square had ever been threatened. We're talking the late 1860s. Tweed started ripping the park to shreds with the intention of building an armory on the eastern side of the park, facing NYU, and he just left piles of dirt and debris, forcing all the people around the park to start moving out. He succeeded on the south side of the park. Almost all the mansions on that side were abandoned. But Eggleston and his cohorts got together and defied him. And held him at bay, and then, of course, the famous trial started, and the end of Boss Tweed, and not the end of Washington Square. Thank you very much, Junior. In 1906, number 12 was replaced by this very odd-looking apartment building. I mean, it's pretty, but... And the 2 houses north were stripped of all their architectural details, sadly. Whereas the house that we're talking about, number 10, which is still standing, was converted into bachelor apartments. And stores, bachelor apartments meant no cooking allowed on the premises. And then stores were added to the ground floor around 1930. Now, what has happened since, as you all know, is the 2 stripped buildings on the north end of the row have been demolished, even though they were landmarked, to be replaced by a high-rise tower, which has been threatening the foundations of the 2 buildings to the south, and all kinds of cracks have opened on 10 Fifth Avenue, which forced the building to be evacuated. So all the people who lived here had to flee their homes because the building is on the verge of collapse. Now, just to clarify, before we move on, this is the oldest structure still standing on Fifth Avenue, but you've all heard me at various times say Salmagundi is the oldest mansion surviving on Fifth Avenue. By 19th century terminology, a mansion is a house with 4 or more windows across it. Eggleston's house only had 3. So that's a townhouse, we're a mansion, and I'm sticking to it. Here's another one of those wonderful photos. Here is 1 Fifth Avenue, the building I talked to you about. In 1911, it was still extremely plain. We're going to talk about 15 Fifth Avenue. What is this structure? It's Bellov House. 1845, built 3 years before the Eggleston and other houses which are right across the street. Here is a little corner of the front yard of that building which is falling down now. Bellov House was built as the first transient hotel on Lower Fifth Avenue. It was fine with the residents around there because there was no place for people to stay unless they were going to stay in their friends' houses, and sometimes the houses were full of people. And the people who chose to stay at the Bellov House were princes and princesses and kings and queens and diplomats and prime ministers, so it was a fairly respectable crowd. And here's where it was located, right here, right across the street from the house I just spoke about. As built by Henry Bellov to cash in on Fifth Avenue's growing cachet. In 1895, 50 years later, owner Albert Clark, he was operator of hotels. He took over control of the operations here too, and he expanded the hotel into his mansion right next door. So I guess he didn't want to live next door to a hotel himself. The hotel remained very, very popular for years into the 20th century. His daughter, Emma Clark Roach, kept it going, but the neighborhood had changed by the 20th century. This was bohemians. This was free thinkers. This was anarchists. And some of the residents, long-term residents of the hotel included Eugene O'Neill, Edna St. Vincent Millay, President Garfield. I guess he was respectable before he was assassinated. Mark Twain in his earlier years. Edith Wharton lived in the building for a while. And shocking, even an opera singer, Fyodor Shalyapin lived there. So the times they were changing, definitely. And then during Prohibition and the Great Depression gave the hotel a real double whammy because they couldn't serve liquor anymore, and the building was getting old. In 1948, the city advised them that they needed to bring the hotel up to code, but by that point it was over 100 years old, and it would have cost more to upgrade the building than the building itself was worth. So the final 52 residents were evicted in 1948. The owner kept the cafe, the restaurant, and the ballroom open, but that wasn't enough to pay the bills. And so once again, in 1952, the entire block was raised, replaced by a high-rise apartment tower, opening in 1955, called the Bellov. So that's where that name comes from. 25th Avenue, real briefly, I just thought this was interesting because it was basically an apartment building built 8 years before the Dakota. And it was built on the empty lots that had been sitting there for half a century and which were the favorite place for baseball games for the neighborhood kids. But finally in 1876, up went this interesting looking building. Anyway, 35 of the 37 suites were pre-rented before the building even opened. And the neighborhood was okay with this because they would rather have a residential hotel in the neighborhood than boarding houses. A residential hotel means the units did not have kitchens, and dining was a la carte in a very elegantly paneled dining room. Public spaces were furnished with gilded moldings, oriental art, and fine furnishings, courtesy of the Rhinelanders. This was really a palace, and it was for people who either didn't want to have a mansion in the city or just were not in the city often enough to have one. And so they treated this very much as a pied-à-terre. Two of the many people who lived in this hotel were particularly interesting are Florence Sutro on the right. She was a child prodigy musician. She was an artist. She was a lawyer. Mind you, this is in the 19th century. She was a woman. She wrote the book Women in Music and Law, and she was a regular exhibitor at the National Academy of Design. And here on the right side is Susan Elizabeth Bellov, who's called the mother of the kindergarten, because she instituted kindergartens in public schools, and she even had a special school to train kindergarten teachers way back in the day. She was the author of Educational Issues in the Kindergarten. They both died in their apartments in the Berkeley. But as is the way of all flesh, in 1937 the Berkeley closed. The contents were dispersed, beautiful paintings, antique furniture. There was quite a rush to get their hands on some of this wonderful stuff that was in the building. And a Art Deco high-rise building replaced it, which is not a bad-looking building. So if you go and look at it, it's got some really nice details. 24 Fifth Avenue, the Renwick House, designed by James Renwick Jr. Here it is on the southeast corner of 9th Street and 5th Avenue. Recognize this? This is Brevard House, practically right next to it. The Renwicks hired their son, James, how convenient, to design this building, but James was already a famous architect. He had already designed Grace Church. When Renwick designed this building, this bedroom right here was designed especially for Washington Irving, who was a close friend of the family and did not have a townhouse in the city, and so would would visit his friends when he was staying in the city for any length of time. In 1876, the Renwicks leased the building to W.B. Girard, who opened it, horrors, as a boarding house, although it would have been a very upscale boarding house. And 50 years after the building was first constructed, Mark Twain leased the house. Among many of the changes he made to the building, this was the place he lived longest in New York City, lived here for 4 years. He installed an Aeolian orchestral player organ, like a player piano, this was a player organ. It was so big, they couldn't get it up into the parlors, so they installed it downstairs on the basement level, and he ran speakers through the walls up to the parlors so he could entertain people. He just loved this player organ. He also loved to play pool, and in 1906, Albert Payne basically moved into the house to write his famous 4-volume biography of Mark Twain. And here is Payne and Twain. Oh, that's cute. Payne and Twain. Here they are playing pool somewhere in this building. In 1925, Twain was long gone by this point. Greenwich Village Historical Society affixed a bronze plaque to the side wall. Unfortunately, I could not find an image of that plaque. It had portraits of Washington Irving and Mark Twain on it, right in the middle. But the house was in trouble financially. They converted it to apartments, and a bank leased the house to convert it into a bank building. But then the Great Depression happened. And in 1933, they had to give the building up in foreclosure. There were attempts to relocate the building as a museum. The Historical Society wanted to just move it somewhere else. They had a big fundraising drive, and they were able to raise $3 of the estimated $70,000 that was needed to move the building. There was even a parade in the mid-1930s where all young children dressed up as Mark Twain characters, and they walked up and down Fifth Avenue holding signs, saying the Mark Twain House, but LaGuardia was not interested. And so finally, in 1954, the entire block was raised, and that building, the Brevard, was constructed on the whole block. Here we are, almost the star of the show for Fifth Avenue. This is the famous Brevard House, the very first house built on Fifth Avenue. And here it is. You can see it on a big plot of land taking up half the Fifth Avenue frontage, and it is freestanding. And it remained freestanding for its entire existence. One of the very few houses on Fifth Avenue that was completely unattached on all 4 sides. Designed by Town and Davis, by the way, very important architects at this point in time. Henry, who built the house, wanted to build on Bond Street or 2nd Avenue, but his grandfather said, "You're building on the farm." And so he constructed the house on the corner of 9th Street and 5th Avenue on the old Brevard farm. He was the one who complained that he felt like he was living in the middle of the woods. A groundbreaking Greek revival design, 1834. This was when Greek revival was hot, hot, hot. A gorgeous doorway. And the house featured 7 main bedrooms, 9 servant rooms, a billiard room, library, and double parlors. It was a showplace, and people just scrambled to get invitations to come to this house, even though they had to travel way up to 9th Street and 5th Avenue in the middle of the woods to go to it. But there was a scandal. On March 1st of 1840, Brevoorts threw a bal costume, as they called it. Everybody in New York wanted to be invited to this thing. Along with many other guests was the Barclays, who he was the British consul in New York, and his daughter Matilda Barclay. She came as the character of Lalla Rookh. I know, right? Don't we all dress up as her? The heroine of an enormously popular epic poem written in 1817 by the Irish poet Thomas Moore. Her costume supposedly cost $300, which is about $10,700 today. So, alright, I don't know what it was made of. So in itself, that was a scandal, how much her costume cost. Also attending was handsome, debonair T. Pollock Burgwin, a wealthy South Carolinian planter. And he was dressed as Pheromore's, who happened to be Lalla Rookh's lover in the poem. Coincidence? As the ball ended in the wee hours of the morning, Matilda and Pollock could not be found anywhere in the house because they had absconded and married at 4 a.m. She was 16 at the time. And here is, I could not find Jane Gordon Bennett's New York Herald, who had a field day with this ball. He covered the story, selling reams and reams of papers per day, fomenting anger because he was comparing the ball, the goings-on, the enormous costs with the plight and problems of the working class. So it was really getting nasty. This is the wedding announcement, but it's in the Brooklyn Star of March 2nd, 1840. I could not find a copy of the Herald that went back this far. The Herald was banned from clubs, hotels, and upper-class homes, and it lost advertisers as a result. As another result, masked balls after this scandal were outlawed in the city for decades afterwards, and stiff fines were leveled on violators. As a side note, the couple remained married less than 2 years. They produced a son who sadly died in infancy. Pollock lost his fortune and died destitute in 1868. Matilda went back home and remained at home caring for her elderly parents until she married late in life. So definitely not a fairy tale. Only 16 years after the Brevoorts built the house, they decided to head uptown, and Henry Durham bought the house for $57,000. He was a distant relative of the Brevoorts, and they held on to this house until after World War I. Although it was always called the Brevoort House. It was sold to Brevoort descendants in 1919, who were hoping to restore it, bringing it back to its former glory. But they changed their mind and sold the house again in 1925. And yes, this is what happened to it. 24 Fifth Avenue Hotel, a residential hotel, opened its doors on August 1st, 1926. A very, very fine building. This is the house on the corner of 9th and 5th Avenue with the restaurant there. And by the way, if you're walking by, I didn't say this, but you can just walk right in the bronze revolving doors and check out the lobby of this gorgeous building. The lobby, Alex and I went in the other day. It's beautiful inside, magnificently restored, intact 1926 lobby. But I did not say to go in there. Okay? So, we're moving up again. There's Brevoort House. This is number 32 Fifth Avenue on the corner of 10th Street. The Schiff Eno Mansion, architecturally an extremely important house. Here it is, also freestanding in 1852 when this map was drawn. Now, Hart Schiff from New Orleans engaged Paris-trained Bellov to design the first The first Second Empire house in the USA. What makes it Second Empire? Well, I'm going to avoid the obvious, and we're going to say, first of all, look at the massing with this projecting little mini bay and the attached pilasters all along here. Definitely not looking like your typical brownstone. But the pièce de la résistance, because this was a French architect, is the roof à la mansarde, as they said, a mansard roof. If you see a mansard roof, I don't care what the rest of the house looks like, that makes it Second Empire, officially. And this was the very first mansard roof, not only in New York, but in the entire USA. The second owner, Josiah Gautier, moved in a year later because Schiff died less than a year after he built the mansion. Gautier also has a very nice French name, and he had tons and tons and tons of money, and he had lots of art, and he could afford this house. Remember, when it was built, it was freestanding, although in this photo, there's buildings on the side of it. He was a bon vivant, a man about town. He loved to go hunting with his buddies, and he and his buddies formed the New York Association for the Protection of Game, because he at least understood that game could not just continuously reproduce itself just for the pleasure of hunters. He knew there needed to be periods when they were off-market. There was a season and there was an off-season. And he and his buddies would go to stores that were selling game, including fish, off-season, with placards and walk around on the street, boycotting the stores and telling people not to shop there. So I just love these feisty multi-millionaires who could just, way cutting edge for their time. In the 1890s, he and his buddies also started buying up other properties on Fifth Avenue because they were trying to stave off development. By the 1890s, the area north of 14th Street, going all the way up into the 50s, was becoming commercial properties. Many of those buildings are still standing to this day. And it was beginning to creep south of 14th Street. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. So they started buying up the buildings and renting them out, rather than risk losing their beloved neighborhood. But ultimately he gave up, and in 1897 he sold the house to Amos R. Eno, vastly wealthy, even richer than he was. He was so rich, he was so rich that in 1884, when his son embezzled money from the Second National Bank that he was running, the bank threatened to collapse, so Eno, okay, thank you. All right, even better. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So he, out of his own pocket, repaid the bank's embezzlement so that it didn't go under and people didn't lose their savings. Although they say he was never the same again afterwards. He was so shaken by what his son had done. His son, Amos F. Eno, inherited the mansion and part of the estate, $1.5 million, and continued the fight to keep development off of Lower Fifth Avenue. He left enormous bequests to many institutions when he died in 1918. And this created a problem because his relatives were not pleased about these bequests. And so they began legal action to say that he was not in his right mind when he wrote his will. So between 1918 and 1923, the estate was in limbo as what they called the bequest-grabbing relatives challenged the will. When the estate was finally settled in 1923, the estate promptly tore down the building and built 30 Fifth Avenue in its place. And I believe there's somebody here tonight who lives in 35th, isn't there? Yes, hi. Hi. So you can tell me everything I've said so far is gospel truth, correct?
We just celebrated the 100th anniversary.
Congratulations. You don't look 100. But congratulations. Fifth Avenue and 10th Street. Is this building so gorgeous? Richard Upjohn, one of his first works, he designed it in 1839. It took 3 years to build, so completed in 1841. There it is, just north of the Eno Mansion, and just norther of Brentwood Mansion. Very early work of Upjohn's, and he modeled the tower on the Magdalen College Tower in Oxford. As you know here, Fifth Avenue was still unpaved when this church was opened, and the Rhinelanders had a lot to do with this church because they knew that they wanted to protect their property values on Fifth Avenue as well. And so they moved the whole parish up from downtown when the older church building burned and rebuilt it there on the corner of 5th and 10th. A big secret at the time, President Tyler and Julia Gardner were married here in 1844. He was the first sitting president to be married while in office, and they got married secretly because they knew if word had gotten out, there would have been mobs in front of the church. And mobs on Fifth Avenue, I'm sorry, are simply not done. Parishioners of the church include the Belmonts, the Rhinelanders, the Astors, and the DePeisters. The parish rectory is also worth taking a look at. Marvelous Gothic revival residential structure. You just don't see these. There are a handful of these in all of today's New York City, greater New York. It was not a style that was popular for private residences because most people felt it looked too ecclesiastical. Progressive Parish, they supported such charities as Libya, Ireland, and the 5 Points. What a combination. And in 1885, go in it sometime. I snapped this picture just the other day. Julia and Serena Rhinelander, the grandchildren of the builders of the Rhinelander Mansion, paid for a redo of the church inside. Stanford White was responsible for the design. It's really very, very beautiful. Isn't the altarpiece Lafarge?
Yes.
Yeah.
And a splash field.
And that's also Salmon. And it's still there today and declared a national landmark. Okay, we're going to talk very briefly about this building, 35 Fifth Avenue. The Grosvenor Hotel, also 1876, right across the street from the church. Also a family residence hotel, and because of its stateliness, once again, the remaining family members of Fifth Avenue did not object to it being there. It was typical in the fact that there was no cooking in the suites. But they all went down to the main floor. That was a picture of a lobby, by the way, not the dining room. Contained suites ranging from 2 rooms and 1 bath to 8 rooms and 2 baths. And the families were permitted to do whatever they wanted with the apartments because they were leasing them long term. Just like anybody who lives in Manhattan today. In 1926, the Grosvenor was replaced by the Grosvenor. 45 Fifth Avenue. I don't know if any of you are recognizing this building right here, next to 45 Fifth Avenue. Let's just say you're sitting in it right now. But 45 Fifth Avenue, a very unusual building. It was built by George Wood, and it's quite distinctive. These sort of hoods over the parlor windows, a very distinctive, singular door frame here. Flat lintels on the 2nd floor and then projecting lintels on the 3rd floor. The double windows. You just don't see a lot of houses like this. Very, very unusual. Plus, it had private stables around the corner. Very few houses on Fifth had this. Wood, although he was a very successful lawyer and very esteemed as a professional, was a very nasty man. He was racist, he was sexist, he was xenophobic. We would not like him very much today. And the house also has a very distinctive history. He died in 1860, only shortly after building the house. The family sold the house in 1866 to the Lennox family, and it was basically rented for the remaining of the 19th century. All sorts of different families, very high-end families, very prestigious families, but it was a rental. And late in the century, it was converted after 1886 to apartments. So, there goes the neighborhood. In 1945, it was demolished for the 16th-story building, but part of it still survives, because around the corner are the stables, still there in place. I'm sure many of you know this building. But it didn't always remain a stable. On July 20th of 1867, it was raided because it had become a very high-end brothel. And in fact, it was such a high-end brothel, it doesn't appear in any of those guidebooks that were issued to visitors, tourists in New York at the time. Later on, the building survived and became a garage in the early 20th century. Later yet, the owner of the Hotel Rensselaer next door, David H. Knott, converted it into a one-family house because he didn't want the property to be developed and cut off all light and air to the side of his building. And into the 1930s and 40s, it was famous for its lovely garden, always flowers. In 1960, the three buildings in the combined package were all sold, and the stables became the conservative synagogue of Fifth Avenue, which it remains to this day. So I just wanted to see this picture really, really quickly, because this is a vista we just don't have anymore. And this is where you really get the idea of just how special Lower Fifth Avenue was. Beautiful houses, but not these enormous palaces, these ostentatious buildings that were being built after the Civil War uptown. It was quiet, it was austere, it was sedate, it was beautiful, it was classy. So, let's take a quick look at First Presbyterian Church, right across the street from us. There it is. Designed by Joseph C. Wells, and what, again, the Magdalen Tower. They moved their congregation up from Wall Street, where their initial church was destroyed in the Great Fire. This is the second church. They have a full block front on Fifth Avenue, and Wells just utilized it magnificently. The South Lawn, which is on the corner of 11th Street, is actually the church graveyard. The bodies were moved up from the graveyard on Wall Street and reinterred on the South Lawn. But they thought it was so pretty without gravestones that they just stuffed the gravestones in the crypt. So as far as I know, they're still downstairs. In the early 20th century, Associate Pastor Dr. Fosdick was famous for his fiery attacks on racism and social injustice. And the lines were up Fifth Avenue here on top. Fabulous windows in the church. 3 by Tiffany, also Salmagundian, 2 by Charles Lamb, and 5 by Maitland Armstrong. Armstrong was also a member. And the building on the north side replaces the building that was the former Salmagundi Club. But it was designed in 1950 by Edgar A. Taffel, a student of Frank Lloyd Wright, and it marks a very important step forward in modern architecture because he tried to communicate with the antique Gothic structure next door. He put in a row of quatrefoil balcony along it. It's modern. He's not pretending it's an old building, but it communicates very nicely with the church next door. Nothing like this had ever been done before. Which brings us to 51 Fifth Avenue. Eli White bought a spec-built house. This is one of the few houses on Fifth Avenue that was spec-built. A transitional Greek Revival Italianate-style house. He owned Eli White & Sons hat manufactory and was the director of the North River Insurance Company. He passed in the house in 1873. What's very interesting in this house is his granddaughter, Caroline Fitzgerald. She was extraordinary. A lot of extraordinary women on Fifth Avenue back in the day, because they had the money, they could afford to be extraordinary. She lived regularly in Europe. She studied poetry and the classics at Yale. She studied Sanskrit, and she married into the British royal family, sort of, in 1889. She married the brother of the Viceroy of India. So she became like the step, something or other of Queen Victoria. But that was enough for New York newspapers. In 1898, William Wood and Company, publisher of medical books and the medical record, moved in, and they stayed there for the next 30 years until in 1928, Wood Mansion was replaced with a 16-story luxury building. And here is the prize winner of Lower Fifth Avenue, the Lennox Mansion. We're almost done, folks. Sorry, I apologize. I tend to get verbose. I don't know if you noticed that. Lennox Mansion was built very early in the Avenue's history, 1841. It was huge. The Lennox family had an enormous China trade fortune, and they owned a farm up in Midtown Manhattan, which we now call Lenox Hill. So there's something to smoke over. And they continued investing in real estate. In 1839, James Lennox inherited the fortune, built the double mansion, retired in 1845, dedicated to collecting rare books, fine art, Auger for the rest of his life, hence the Lennox Collection, which is now part of the New York Public Library. He was a noted recluse, a very prominent Brooklyn minister, thank you. Came knocking at the door when they presented his card and said, please, I would very much like to meet Mr. Lennox and see his collection. Door was slammed in his face. He was left standing up there on the sidewalk. And a few minutes later, the servant returned, handed him back his card, says, Mr. Lennox says, never heard of you, don't know you, go away. and he closed the door, and that's what happened. However, he was extremely generous with charities, and he was very, very loving to his other family members. He just did not like the general public. So most people never got to see the inside, but here we are getting to see the front entryway to this house that was just filled with treasure. He left the house to the Presbyterian church across the street, and he also donated his collection to the Lenox Library, which was built way uptown on 5th Avenue and 71st Street, and remained standing there until the early 20th century when the collections were moved to 42nd Street. Oh, by the way, the building was the home of the precursor of the Juilliard School in the early 20th century. But it was replaced by a monster tower in 1911. This is exactly the thing that the Fifth Avenue Association was formed to fight in 1907. This monster tower could not have been built after 1916 because now Lower Fifth Avenue is regulated. If you notice, commercial building stops right at the corner of 12th Street. Everything south of 12th Street, it's high-rise, but it's residential. It's not commercial. We can thank the Fifth Avenue Association for that. And last but not least, 65th Avenue, one of the most important mansions. This is here, not the windows facing the lawn, but the windows facing the street, was the former site of Salmagundi. They rented the Richard Upjohn townhouse until 1917. So in 1911, when this photo was taken, that's where Salmagundi was before they bought this building. There it is on the map. Very austere on the outside. That's what people did back in the day. Robert Minter was the scion of the shipping empire. His father lost all his money in 1812, and Robert Minter regained it all, working with his partner and then brother-in-law, Grinnell, to make their shipping company the most prominent in New York. He personally paid for the Flying Cloud, which was the most famous of all the clipper ships. He paid for it out of his own pocket. And it held the record until something like 2008. He and his pals would meet Thursday nights to solve the problems of the world, and one Thursday night, after he and his wife, Anna, returned from an 18-month stay in Europe, poor people, they noticed that there were promenades and gardens all over Europe, and New York didn't really have anything like that. So we met Anna in on the stag meeting one night. She said, wouldn't it be nice if we created a park in New York, something where people could go to and promenade and enjoy nature? And his buddies all thought that was a great idea, and that was the birth of Central Park in 1848. He actually donated a substantial amount of the land, which is now Central Park. In 1866, he died. His son, suffering a nervous disorder, committed suicide in 1881, and the house remained empty for 10 years until Harry LeGrand Cannon and Elizabeth Mary moved in and had a whale of a time in this house, well into the 20th century, but yeah, ultimately the property was sold in 1915. But notice the difference between what we call the Forbes building today and that monster that's right across the street from it. This was built in 1924 as the Macmillan and Company building, later the Forbes building. And that brings me to this photo of the inside of our parlors. This is what these houses look like inside. Very, very rare examples of photos of interiors at this time. But that's our Mrs. Hawley, and that's our front parlor. So come in and take a look at it. And notice all the art that's hanging on the walls in 1871. So I think now it's time to quench our thirst and our hunger. We could stop at Delmonico's, or we could just go downstairs.